Hi, welcome back to Microsoft Virtual Academy, where we're talking about Template 10. We've done a number of sessions already introducing some of the basic concepts, and now we're going to talk about Bootstrapper, which we've referred to throughout the previous sessions, but now it's time to get into a little bit more detail.
This might be the heart of Template 10. And in fact, if you're considering using Template 10 but skipping using Bootstrapper, I think you might actually find Template 10 difficult to use. Bootstrapper is really an assumption that Template 10 is already implemented in your project. And what is it? It's a replacement to the application class that is derived inside your XAML CS, app XAML CS.
Yep. It's, as you say, it really pulls together the whole ecosystem that is Template 10 and makes it easy to leverage those out-of-the-box capabilities. Not that you can't use them independently, just makes it a lot harder to set those things up.
Things like navigation service won't work properly unless you go and manually start implementing them. And you're going to find it quite a bit of work to get Template 10 working for you if you don't use the Bootstrapper. Bootstrapper is actually a great thing for you to use as well. It's a drop-in replacement for application, and it centralizes all of the activation code to just on-started async. There's a couple other things that it does. It manages the extended splash screen for you, does all of that logic include.
So what is an extended splash screen, just for those people who are not familiar with it?
Sure, the extended splash screen is that if you violate the 10 seconds that you have to show UI when your application is launched, you'll be automatically terminated by the platform. So what you can do if you have a lot of startup logic and it's very costly, what you can do is show a second splash screen that basically models and maybe sometimes animates the default splash screen. And anyway, implementing that and when to hide it, when to show it, can actually be quite sophisticated, and it's part of the Bootstrapper and does that for you. It creates the initial root frame for you, wraps the initial root frame in a navigation service for you, and then redirects all the activation into a simple pipeline of initialized and started. And so if you were to compare this with the out-of-the-box application class that comes with UWP apps, it's actually very sophisticated, right? You're looking at the native implementation. You got to keep your head really, really straight on what's going on. And so a lot of that is just really not necessary. It's just boilerplate sort of stuff that's easy and brittle to break. And so it's all wrapped inside the Bootstrapper. When you look at Bootstrapper, there's really not very many exposed methods. In fact, right here, we show the properties that you have. And we'll talk about the methods in just a second. But one of them is, or many of them have to do with the back button, whether or not to show the back button and how to handle the back button as well. So a centralized back button method or event that's raised called back requested, and how to show and hide that, all of which you have access to the raw APIs to do yourself. This just kind of wraps that to keep it nice and simple.
Yeah, and it's fair to say that although you don't have to use a navigation style application, a lot of the services that were built were really to simplify the creation and maintenance of navigation style applications.
That's right. Two of the more complex features of Bootstrapper. One is the automatic support for suspension. So it handles the suspend and resume for you, and it automatically attempts to save and restore your navigation state in your frame for you as well. And it works in tandem with the navigation service that ships with Template 10. And so that's really nice because you would write all that code in your application anyway, and it would be a lot of code and easy to get wrong. And so not only have we put together the basic, but there's a lot of contribution and a lot of involvement with the community inside this open source project. And so it's really gone its paces to really support both the mainstream use cases and several edge cases as well. And so I think you're going to find that this really makes your life really, really simple once you get kind of the gist of it. And honestly, there's not much you have to implement in order to make it work.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things to understand is, for sure, this has moved away a little bit from what you get with the out-of-the-box blank app.
Yeah.
And a lot of the basic documentation you would see on MSDN that talk about how you manage resume, suspend cycles, and how you manage navigation, and so on and so forth. And we'll touch on that in later sessions where we talk specifically about MVVM, where we talk about the navigation service, and so on and so forth.
And you might ask, how can we wrap it in this way so that it works for everybody, and why didn't the original APIs do that for you? And the reality is, all of Template 10 really only serves about 80% of all the developers out there. There are going to be edge case apps that it simply doesn't serve correctly, and you're going to need to write your own framework sort of implementation. And maybe Template 10 won't fit in some of these special edge cases. But in 80%, and that's a big percentage of all the apps out there, this is going to be the approach that everybody would have taken. So it only makes sense to be able to encapsulate that and just give a few parameters so it can be customized, makes it go from 50% to 80% in a really simple way. Another sophisticated or a complex sort of capability that Bootstrapper gives you is support for dependency injection of your view models. That is, every time that I do a navigation into a page, we assume that that page has a view model. So we're saying that it doesn't have to have a view model and nothing will break. But if it does have that view model, then we can assume a lot of things and give a lot of capabilities to you, including in the on-navigated too. And when we try and access that view model, if it's not there already, we'll allow you to use dependency injection to create and inject that view model for you. Again, you may never decide to use dependency injection and it feels too complex or something like too heavy for you, then you never have to do it. But if you do, that's the reason we have methods like resolve for page.
Sure. And one of the key things as well is that we tried very hard to make this system not dependent on a specific type of dependency injection. So you might use Ninject, you might use Unity, you might use another version of dependency injection, such as MVVM Lite's lightweight IOC container and so on and so forth. You can use all of those with Template 10. You're not forced to use one specific one. The same with the MVVM frameworks. You know, we have a basic implementation, but you're free to leverage other MVVM frameworks should you so wish. So those are important things to bear in mind.
We certainly don't want to compete with or try and replace the MVVM framework that you know and love, or the dependency injection framework that you know and love. In fact, we don't have the full capabilities of many of those frameworks. We just have the basics so that we can get off the ground. I think it's probably worth stepping back and talking about the pipeline, the activation pipeline for the way the Bootstrapper starts your application. So every application inside AppXAML is going to have its constructor, and so that's where you're going to do the initial initialization of the XAML that you have. So that usually those are global resources that you're initializing. So you'll always get that, and certain properties can only be set in the constructor. So, for example, you may want to change, based on a setting, you may want to change the overall theme of your application. Well, in order to change your application theme, you must do it in the constructor of your application. So that's the reason, obviously, we would expose constructor. But then there's four steps total. The constructor is where it starts, and then it goes into onInitialize async. And so you're going to notice that each of these are going to be overrides inside the Bootstrapper, and each of these overrides is also going to be async. And so this is important because there's a lot of operations that you might need to start up your application that require file access or perhaps a web service call or something like that, all of which are going to need async. And so we provide this as an async override, but you're also going to see that when you're not doing async, when you're just doing synchronous startup calls, you're still going to need to handle this async notion, right? You'll be returning a task. And so we go from constructor to initialize, and then let's skip this one and go straight to start, because that's going to be 90% of all the apps out there. Just from constructor to initialize to start. And then start is going to basically be all the ways your application gets invoked. So that includes activation, and it includes launch. And the only time start doesn't get raised, there are two scenarios. One is if you're being resumed. Is that the right word? Can you say it that way?
Yeah.
If you're resuming from a terminated state, so that means your application was suspended, and typically because of resource constraints, your application was then removed from memory and terminated. So if that happens, then we can restore back to the original state, and so we don't need to call the start async. The other scenario would be, and this is an edge case, but this would be for pre-launch, and that's what that third step is. And so we go from the constructor to initialize, and then optionally you might implement on pre-launch. And on pre-launch is a feature of the platform that launches your application for around 16 seconds, allowing it to load up all of its resources that may actually have a costly startup time.
And that's normally when you've downloaded the application from the store. There's kind of this optional phase that the system may or may not choose to pre-launch you.
May or may not is a good point. Yeah, that's right. In fact, as your system is idle, it will start to pre-launch apps as well. And it's going to be based on your usage of the applications. It won't pre-launch apps that you never participate in. Anyway, So you have pre-launch, and the purpose of pre-launch is to do a bunch of the work so that the actual launch time, when the user clicks it, is very, very quick. Now, the reason you would handle pre-launch is because some things that you do at the launch of your application may be inappropriate to do behind the scenes. An example might be a social check-in. I have an application that says I'm online, but I'm not really online. If it's pre-launching, it's only online when the user launches it. So in pre-launch, you would say, don't make it look like I'm online, but make it look like I'm online when the user does it. So pre-launch gives you one option, and that is to continue or to not continue to on start. So that's up to you. It's a output property or output parameter on the override. And if you say true or false, it will continue through the on start for you, or it will pause it. And when the user actually launches it, it will continue the on launch for you. So pretty powerful, and just a more boilerplate stuff that you would have to write for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, and the sort of typical scenarios you'd be leveraging there could be initial creation and population of a database.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those things that maybe that there would be a certain startup tax that if this can be done whilst the system's quiescent before it delays a user, then it's a really good idea to do it at this point.
Or something that requires user interaction, and since there is no user interaction, it doesn't make sense. I hate that we've talked about pre-launch so much already, because it's such an edge case that most of you won't even care about it. But when you do start to care about it, then there's the implementation.
Though you may notice it if your app fails the WAC test, because it doesn't support
WAC meaning the Windows Application Certification Kit. Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so I'm going to open up an application real quick and just kind of show you the basic implementation. So I'm just going to start up a blank app and open up its XAML here, or its app XAML, so you can kind of see its construction. And so it's worth pointing out that I get to rebuild and refresh real quick. So I love doing that, so I'm glad I get to. And
it never gets old, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. So I'm going to delete all these just so we can do them ourselves, and you can kind of get a feel for what's about to happen. And so is this a close and reopen operation to get that right? There we go. Look at that. Terrific. No. Nice try, Jerry.
You got to refresh after it's built.
I thought I did. There we are. All the files, but not the editor until I click it.
Yeah.
Lovely. All right, so out of the box, you do get the link that takes you to all the documentation for the Bootstrapper. So don't feel like if this isn't making sense to you now, how am I ever going to figure it out? It's well documented.
And that's what rewind is for.
And it's what pause and rewind is for as well, right? If you're watching this on triple speed, that's what you get. All right, so if I override inside my application here, so again, remember, I'm inheriting from Bootstrapper. Even if I were to open up AppXAML, you can see it's Bootstrapper that is the base class here. So this is already handled for you. And by the way, we default to requested theme is light because that's the new standard. Mm-hmm. Standards change, you know. All right, so
default is no longer the recommended default.
Default is no longer the recommended default. Light is. Yeah, that's funny. All right, so here are all the overrides. Several of them you won't care about except for edge cases, but I'll just step through them real quickly so that you can understand what's going on. We'll begin with onInitialize. So I have onInitialize, and you'll remember that these are meant to be async. They don't out of the box. They are not out of the box asynchronous, and that's because there's no asynchronicity code. But either way, the return type is still a task. And so I have the luxury of it in initialize. I can return the base class, which is virtual instead of abstract. But my other option would be to return a task of a completed. And so that's just like executing a task, only it's done, right? And so once I start introducing awaits into this method, I would take that out, and I would start doing it differently. So this would be my initial piece. And remember, initialize happens every single time, regardless of resuming or anything else like that. You always get initialized. The other override is on pre-launch. And so here's on pre-launch, same story as before. It's still an async operation. So I would either return the base, which I can here, or I would return a completed task. I might point out that I can return a completed task. I just can't not only do that, because there's one extra thing that pre-launch has, and that's that output parameter that's passed in right here.
Yep.
I have to set the value to whether or not I'm going to continue. So this is run on start async. If I say false here, it will not do it during pre-launch, but it will do it when the user finally launches. That's pretty cool, actually. Mm-hmm. So again, this is an edge case. I hate that I even put it on there, but there it is. And then finally, override for on start. And so this is everything. And so in in the out-of-the-box experience, you either have activated or launched, and we still maintain that context if it's important to you. So that's the start kind. So in this case, I'll say if start kind, right? So that's passed in to me, equals, wait, it's a little s. If it equals, and then I have whether or not it was activated or launched. So that's the way I would determine what it's how I actually got here.
And so what are the
most cases I don't care. Well, theoretically, what it means is if I'm launched, my application wasn't previously running, and so I'm launched to do it. Activated means my application is already running, and something like somebody clicked my start tile twice, you know, and the second time it popped up and all it did was activate my application. What we found is in the application class where we have activated and launched, those aren't always consistent. So they're always consistent here because everything is on started. But if for some reason you need those, they're there. I actually haven't found a use case where I use start kind, to be honest.
Yeah. I think when we were initially developing it, and as we started to track through various scenarios, you know, such as when you've been protocol activated, or whether you've been activated from a secondary tile or search, or so on and so forth, there was all these different scenarios, and we were tracking through them.
So for sure, we don't want to lose capabilities that we already have. So I'm glad we still pass it. All right. So the other is the args. These are all of the args that we could possibly have. So, for example, I'll just cast one to E. Args equal or as protocol activation. Since you said that, that's a great example. And so because I activated event args is the root implementation of everything, launched and activated, I can use that. And I can now cast args then into protocol activated, but it might be null because that's not how I was activated. It's an easy way to test, but I could also just say args.kind, and then it has all the different ways that your application might be activated. And again, this goes back now to documentation on MSDN, right? This is just the standard stuff. All the template 10 is trying to do is bring it into a single override of on started async and make it asynchronous.
Yeah, ultimately, if your application is launched in many different ways, has integration with Cortana, has integration with secondary tiles, has all of these things, you still need to code how you want your application to respond in those scenarios. You know, we can't do all of that for you, but what we can create is a much more consolidated and consistent approach to how you identify those scenarios and then handle them.
In its basic sense, a bootstrapper would be implemented like this. You would have, you might not even need on initialize because the type of app you have doesn't require upfront operations, but there is a built-in property called navigation service that allows you to navigate to the first page, wherever that's going to be. And so I can say navigate to, and then just like a standard navigation off of a XAML frame, that syntax is the same here. And I can say views.main page, and I'm done. So this would be the like the basic implementation, where on start, the first thing I want to do is make sure I go to my main page, the end. I don't need anything else. There's no operation here that is long running, but if there were, then suddenly I'd be interested in things like the splash screen, which I would set up here inside the constructor, and I would just say something like splash factory equals, right? And then I'm passing it a function, and basically this is that function. And it's going to return, I don't know, something, right? Wherever it is that your splash screen exists, it will show that until you do the navigation. So if you do have a long run operation, then you can use the extended splash screen as well. So it went from the basic implementation to a little bit more sophisticated, and then we could introduce initialize for a little bit more sophisticated if we want to, and maybe even pre-launch if it's the right thing for our application. That's the Bootstrapper overview.
Yes.
Yeah. And you really can't bypass the Bootstrapper if you're going to use template 10. If you feel like the Bootstrapper isn't right for your app, probably template 10 isn't right for your app either. Okay, that's it. That's the Bootstrapper in template 10. Good luck.